Today I'm reviewing The Linguistic Wars, Chomsky, Lakoff, and the Battle Over Deep Structure by Randy Allen Harris, second edition. Right, so there's a lot to talk about with this book. Both the contents of the book itself, which covers a lot, and a lot of complex things within here, but also my own history with this book, which is a little bit muddled, and I'll get into that in just a second. I'm going to do my best to keep things succinct and not go off on any tangents, but I really can't promise anything. If you've watched any videos on this channel, you know my style. I do them unscripted. I am unfortunately prone to rambling or getting lost on digressions or losing my train of thought. And yeah, I'll try. I'll try, but no promises. Also, I'm going to be repeating some information I said in previous videos, but I'll try to move through things as quickly as possible. So let me just start with what this book is about. So this book is about Chomsky, who I think most people know, but not everybody. Chomsky is famous. He's famous in a number of fields, which is actually something that comes through in this book very well. He's famous in philosophy. He's famous in computer science. He's famous in AI. But his big claims to fame are linguistics, and he is also a political activist, a writer and speaker. Those are two separate tracks. On the one hand, there's his academic work as a linguist. On the other hand, there's his writings and speaking as an activist. They're almost like two completely separate lives. People who know him for his activism tend to know very little about his linguistics, and perhaps some people who study his linguistics don't know much about his activism. Actually, sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but in my experience living abroad, this is especially true outside the U.S. So my Japanese friends or my Taiwanese friends know Chomsky as a linguist. They have no idea he's a political activist. But anyways. My own personal history with this. So I was recommended Chomsky's political writings when I was in college. I was doing a paper on the Sandinista Revolution in Nicaragua. I was talking to one of the professors about it, and he said, if you want to know anything about the Third World and how it's covered in the U.S. media, you have to read Chomsky. And that was my first introduction to Chomsky. Now, Chomsky has a bit of a unique space in the culture. He is very revered in certain circles. Again, I guess linguistics and leftist politics. But he doesn't get invited on mainstream television very much, especially during this period in the 90s. So you would never see him on the news. And unless somebody recommended him to you, you would never really hear about them. I think, obviously, with the internet and YouTube, that's changed now, where he's much more accessible now, and arguably more well-known now, although, again, within certain circles. But he's certainly much more accessible now. You can find his videos all over YouTube, which is another point that's made here in this book. But anyways, after being recommended with his political stuff, I was predisposed to be favorable to it anyways, because Chomsky's on the left and I was on the left, and very quickly fell under the influence of Chomsky. And again, this is a point that's made in the book. But he is an incredibly authoritative and persuasive speaker. Not that he's always right, and again, that's a point that's made repeatedly in this book, but when you listen to him, you feel like he's got all the answers. And again, if you're predisposed to agree with his politics, he's very good at political debates. Again, sorry, something that's mentioned in this book. There are clips on YouTube. The most famous one, again, something that's mentioned in this book, maybe. His 1969 appearance on the firing line against William Buckley, where he just completely eviscerated him. And that there are other clips of or clips or even audio files of some of those debates, other political debates. So if you're on the left and you're looking for someone to articulate a leftist worldview of U.S. foreign policy and to just completely eviscerate anyone who might have an opposing view, Chomsky can easily become an idol, and I idolized him for years. I think all of my 20s and all of my 30s. I've come off of that now. I'm in my mid 40s now. And for a few different reasons, but I think largely just because idols, having idols is a young man's game. You know, when you're young, you're predisposed to idolize certain figures. When you get older, you become a lot more cynical about the world. So that was the space I was already at before reading this book. Is not quite as enthralled with Chomsky as I used to be, largely just because of a factor of age. But this book does, this book does have a number of criticisms of Chomsky. So it's something which is something which you can, if you were disposed to completely idolize him, there might be parts of this which could be challenging reading or difficult reading. All right, so Chomsky's other great career is in linguistics. And like I said, it's completely separate from his political career. And I have, over the years, gotten into linguistics a little bit sideways. I was a history poli-sci major in college, major minor. But then I ended up teaching English in Asia, as a lot of history majors do, and getting qualifications in the teaching of foreign languages or the teaching of English language, which gets into the field of second language acquisition and the field of what is known as applied linguistics. And from that, I started to make sideways progress into linguistics. And I have tried to understand Chomsky's linguistics. I have this book, Chomsky's Universal Grammar, which I reviewed on this channel, kind of. The review was mostly just me talking about how I didn't understand it at all. You can see my notes here. What I don't understand. It was this book was a real challenge for me, and this was my realization that this stuff was. Look at this. At this point, I've largely given up trying to understand. This book was my realization that this stuff was way too difficult for me. I don't know. Maybe if I went back to school, took linguistics again from freshman year or something, and really made a go of it, maybe I could understand it. But certainly as a casual reader, I had no hope of understanding Chomsky's linguistics. His linguistic theories can be quite complex. Tried to get into Chomsky's theories, but could not do it. But this book was recommended by my sister, who did actually study linguistics as a PhD in linguistic anthropology. My sister told me that it's pretty easy to understand. This is the Linguistic Wars, the first edition. I struggled to understand it, the linguistics part of it, but there was also an interesting narrative in this book. So maybe I'll take a step back here and talk about what is the Linguistic Wars. So I'm going to oversimplify here slightly just for the sake of simplicity and time. But Chomsky completely revolutionized the field of linguistics in the 1950s and 60s and set a new generation of linguists forth on the project of transformational grammar, trying to figure out what are the small subset of rules which would explain all the grammar transformations in the English language. That movement sparked some what's the word I'm looking for? It sparked some avenues that Chomsky himself was not happy with in the late 60s and early 70s. And so Chomsky turned on his former disciples, his former students, and they fought back, and things got ugly, as is made quite clear in these books. Shouting matches at conferences and very partisan politics in academia. And so that whole ugly period is what's known as the Linguistic Wars. So Chomsky's actually been involved in several disputes in linguistics over his time, and again, that's something which comes through very clearly in this book. But this particular one is, I guess, the most infamous, the Linguistic Wars from the late 60s and 70s. So, my sister recommended this book to me. I picked this up a few years ago and read it and reviewed it on this channel a couple years ago, and I'll link to the video in the description down below. I'll try and remember to link to everything I mentioned down below. I reviewed it on this channel and also reviewed it on my weblog, which is a companion to this YouTube channel. And that review actually caught the attention of the author himself, Randy Allen Harris, who was kind enough to comment on my review, tell me he had a second edition coming out. I actually had no idea that a second edition was coming out at that time. But it turns out after, 30 years or something. When was the first? 1993. So it turns out 30 years later, we are now here with the second edition, updated to include stuff from the past 30 years. So that was just a little bit of coincidence of timing that I happened to write my review for the first edition just at the time the second edition was coming out. Randy Allen Harris received my review very graciously. I had some critical things to say about the book. I guess largely I had a hard time understanding the linguistics part of it. But he took those criticisms very graciously. He said he was quite happy I had spent as much time with his book as I had, kind of thinking over it for a long review. And then more recently, he, at his own expense, sent me out a copy of the second edition, which I'm very grateful for, and I think was a very nice gesture on his part. And for that matter, I'm also grateful for the attention he paid to my blog. Now, geez, I'm 14 minutes into this and I haven't even started the review. Okay, I did make that disclaimer at the beginning, didn't I? Anyways, when I do get into this review, any minute now, I'm going to do my best not to pull my punches, to be just as critical of this book as I would be if I didn't have that relationship with the author. I suspect Randy Allen Harris will understand that. Just my desire to be honest in these reviews. Nevertheless, take what I have to say with a grain of salt, because as much as I'm going to try to be critical, it's more than possible that at a subconscious level I'm more favorably predisposed to the author now, and not to mention the knowledge that there's a good probability he'll watch this review, especially as we've been in contact. Okay, I think those are all the preliminaries. I'm sure I forgot a million important things, but yeah, I think what I'm going to try and do with this review, I've already reviewed the first edition on this channel. I will link to that down below. Now, there is a lot changed in the second edition, but there's also a lot that's the same, and the basic story is the same. So I think I'm going to try to avoid the temptation to just recount the story of the Linguistic Wars, because I already did that in my previous video, and I'll leave a link to my review of the first edition in the description down below. And what I'm going to try and do is maybe talk about the second edition, and then maybe touch on some of the content of it as I go through this. I mean, the first thing that you can see, can you see this here? There's a difference in size. This one is considerably bigger. It's got 30 years of additional history to add in. There's an interesting note at the beginning, the preface to the second edition. And this is something Randy Allen Harris had also alluded to, I think, in his correspondence with me, that the beginning of the book is very different. Actually, let me see if I can find the exact quote. Sorry, I should have bookmarked this ahead of time, but like I said, these are unscripted. Where is it? Yeah, I think it's here. The major regret I have with this edition is that the scholarship on the history of linguistics has grown impressively in the decades after the first edition, giving a much rounder picture of both the Bloomfeldians, whom I largely caricatured in that edition, even more than I realized at the time, and also of Chomsky's rise. In an early draft of this edition, I incorporated the insights and findings of that scholarship, but the manuscript ballooned up so alarmingly to the publisher that I had to trim it way back, and all of that material ended up on the cutting room floor, along with some bits and pieces from the post-bellum coverage. Essentially, what he's saying there is he was operating under editorial constraints about the length of this book, which constrained a lot of the content. And, I thought that was interesting because it's one of those things, I'm sure that probably affects just about every book we read, right? But I never really think about it as a reader. I just think like the book is the natural length that it's supposed to be. And if stuff got left out, then that's the author's fault for leaving it out. But it's one of those things that's obvious when somebody points it out to you. Of course, any book, the publishers are looking to keep it in a manageable binding that can be easily sold. They don't want it to be like 900 pages, right? So that's something I have to admit I was not cognizant of, or I was not thinking of in my review of the first edition. That when things are not explained adequately, and quite often things are not explained adequately, it could often be because there are editorial constraints on that, so that the author can't, that just doesn't have the space to give something the discussion it deserves. So as he mentions here, he's essentially had to cut out the beginning of the book, which was in the first edition, which talked about the state of linguistics before Chomsky. So the first chapter in the first edition is talking about why linguistics were the way that they were in the early part of the 20th century. And he gives a whole history of it, going all the way back to the ancient Greeks. It is, as he says, a very quick history. But then he comes into the Bloomfeldians, who... It's interesting that in the second edition, he says he caricatured them. Makes me wonder how accurate his description of them was in the first edition. But in the first edition, the caricature was, or the description was, that the Bloomfeldians were obsessed with cataloging languages. So going out, finding Indian languages that nobody had ever cataloged. What's the phonology? What's the sound system? What is the vocabulary? What's the grammar? What are the sentences? And just they had little basic units of building blocks that they would start with the phoneme. Phonemes would build into words. Words would build into grammar, and just cataloging this. Whereas the Chomsky came along and had a revolution of trying to figure out how transformations in sentences work. So how our linguistic system is able to transfer a statement into a question, a present tense into past tense, an active into passive, a clause into a relative clause, or a complex noun phrase, or something like that. And so that's what so excited Chomsky's contemporaries when he came around in the 50s and 60s in the Chomsky and Revolution. That is largely gone here. We kind of start right off with Chomsky and his revolution. In a way, it's good. We pick up this book because we're interested in Chomsky. So we get to jump right to the good stuff, right to Chomsky and his innovations. But I was worried several times throughout this book. There are references to the Bloomfeldians, but and the linguists before Chomsky. But I'm a little worried that somebody who had picked up the second edition and had never read the first edition would just be missing out on what separated Chomsky from the previous generations of linguists. So, if you're interested in this stuff, you might just want to pick up the first edition and the second edition, huh? There's a lot of stuff that's in the first edition that's not in the second edition, and vice versa. If you're interested in it, there could be worse uses of your time. I'm sure the first edition is out of print, right? By definition, that's what happens when the second edition comes out. But you could track it down at your library, Amazon used books, I'm sure. So, one of the things, though, I think that I realized in the second edition, what was the appeal that Chomsky made to the linguists of his generation was to be able to describe transformations with mathematical precision. So you have these sentence transformations, and you would write out exactly what was needed in these transformations, and then they could be applied to any sentence of that type. So it was like applying mathematical formulas to grammar or linguistics. Now, I'm sure for the average person, that sounds like the worst thing ever, combining grammar and math. But there's a certain type of person who really gets into this, I guess, namely grammarians or linguists. There's a quote in the second edition. I don't think this was in the first edition, where somebody says there's a Gyro Gearless thrill to it. Gyro Gearless being the character from the Uncle Scrooge comic books, the inventor of having a formula, you'd be able to put one sentence in, put it through the machine would be the formula, and then the new sentence would pop out the other side, and the formula, at least in the early days, seemed to be airtight. Like it seemed like they were developing, they were mapping out the rules of grammar with formulas in a way that seemed to be airtight, and that was the appeal of the early days. But yeah, there's a great quote. Let me see if I can find it here. The beauty of deep structure here, talking about Chomsky's model, and I think it's the end of the end of the chapter. This is a great quote. It's in the first edition as well. So the aspects model, that was Chomsky's model of language. The aspects model was elegant and compelling, but it leaked. So, then we get into the problems with it. So the more the linguists began to poke at it and dig at it and get into the different grammar, they began to discover that there's a lot of English grammar that's not accounted for in Chomsky's rules. And so that set off a whole bunch of research to try and dig deeper into the grammar and figure out what the rules were. I'm summarizing the book, aren't I? I said that's what I wasn't going to do. Sorry. So actually, let me take a step back. Something I should have made clear at the beginning of this review. This is the danger of doing these unscripted. I've not reread the first edition, because that's a lot of work, and these reviews are just hobbies for me. So when I make comparisons between the first edition and the second edition, I'm largely doing it from memory. There's one or two passages that I've looked up to check. So take that with a grain of salt. The other thing is, where was I going with this? Oh, okay, back to the story. Then we get into the different models of language and the generative semantics, which is the rival. They started off as Chomsky's disciples, but then when Chomsky tried to crack down on their model, they went off into a separate school, or a separate model. Actually, that's an oversimplification. You can see what a big book it is, huh? Lakoff was actually kind of courting the notoriety of being the next Chomsky, of developing his own model. So it wasn't all on Chomsky for the divide. Again, for the full version, check out the book. But anyways, they split it into two different camps. And this is where I largely started to get confused in the first edition. So this is the first edition here. These are my notes on the first edition. I've largely given up trying to understand several pages ago. So I got confused here on the first edition with the competing grammatical theories or the descriptions of what's going on here. I felt like in the second edition it wasn't quite as bad. Now, who knows? Maybe that's because this was my second time through. Or who knows, maybe that's because my expectations were reduced. Maybe, I went in expecting not to understand everything. And I didn't understand everything. But I do feel like in the second edition, we're getting more of a bird's eye view of it. So we're not getting into the technicalities of it as much as I remember from the first edition. We're just getting very generic summaries of kind of what's going on in these theories without really getting into the nitty-gritty of it. So I felt like the second edition was more readable in that regard. That's not to say there weren't places where I got a bit lost. There were. But I expected to get a bit lost at places, again, because of my experience with the first edition. Now, this may be as good a time to say this as any. I think there are places... Yeah, I think largely the author is doing the best he can with this. And again, like I mentioned at the top of this review, as he made clear in his preface to the second edition, he's under editorial constraints in terms of how much the publisher will let him have. So, I'm sure there's stuff that's not explained thoroughly because there was not room to explain it thoroughly. Yes. Sorry, I lost my train of thought here. What I want to say is, I think for the non-specialist reader, there will be frustrations in this book. Again, I found the second edition slightly less frustrating than the first edition, but then again, it was my second time through it. So I think that's something you can just go ahead and expect if you pick this up and you don't have a linguistics background. But I'm going to give it a cautious recommendation anyways, just because there's enough interesting stuff in here that makes up for some of the passages that are difficult to understand. And I think if you have ambitions to become cultured or somewhat cultured, or have any interest in the history of ideas or philosophy or the 20th century in academia, even if you're not a specialist in linguistics, and as something that comes through quite clearly in this book is just Chomsky as one of the intellectual titans of the 20th century, for all his faults, and his faults are many in this book. And just the interesting cycles that linguistics went through in this period. And linguistics can be interesting once you get into it, thinking about what is the human capacity for language? How much does language affect our thinking, or how much does our thinking affect our language? There's an element there of wide appeal, I think, if you give it a chance. So, sorry, it's a roundabout way of saying I give this a cautious recommendation. I think, I mean, go in maybe expecting, don't go in expecting to understand everything. If you hit passages that you can't understand, just keep going. There will be, and I think you'll once you start it, um, you'll see exactly what I mean. There's enough interesting things in there to keep you going. And I guess while I'm singing this book's praises, uh, Randy Allen Harris is a very talented writer. I know I said at the beginning of this review there's a high probability he's going to be watching this, so I I feel a little bit strange saying it, but it's true. There's a lot of humor mixed in here. There's some very interesting stuff about Chomsky's place in the culture, which I thought was very well written. There are some the narrative was quite engaging. The book is very well written. So sorry, most of the book is very well written. It's the linguistic description stuff. Sorry, I'm just going to circle around to what I was saying earlier. I'm sympathetic to the fact that he doesn't have enough space to explain all the stuff he needs to explain. That being said, there were one or two spots where, and with apologies, I didn't bookmark these, so I can't tell you where they are, but there's just in my memory, there were one or two spots where he was talking about something which was an important turning point in linguistics in the 50s or 60s. And I just thought it just needed a little bit more explanation. And yeah, I really wish I maybe could have been in on the drafting of this book or something, and said to him, this part here, it just needs to be explained a little bit more. I'm not quite clear what you mean on it. And then I think that's mostly maybe in the beginning of the book. When we get into some of the nitty gritty of the theories, then at that point I'm not expecting to understand everything. On the other hand, though, there are some parts which are explained rather well. So again, I think you just have to, the potential reader for this book just has to expect not to understand everything, and just take from it the parts that you can understand. I should always make the disclaimer, though, that maybe it's me, right? Maybe I'm the idiot. So let me know what you think of the book. Okay. Boy, my promise not to ramble at the beginning of this video has not turned out well, has it? Although actually it wasn't. I explicitly said it wasn't a promise, didn't I? So maybe I'm just doing what I thought I would do. Okay, I'm going to, I think, skip through the chapters that cover the linguistic war proper. And again, I already have a video on this channel talking about that from the first edition. So I'm not going to go through all that again, other than to say there are a couple passages that get some more detail in the second edition. And the best example of this is a linguistic conference. I think this was 1969, where one of Chomsky's graduate students and George Lakoff in the opposing camp were yelling obscenities at each other on the microphone in front of, I think, Randy Allen Harris describes it as 200 embarrassed onlookers. In the first edition, we are just told that it happened, but there's not very much description. In the second edition, I don't know what happened. Maybe more information came to light or more stuff was published, but we get a little bit more of a blow-by-blow description. So they're having some sort of argument. George Lakoff says, fuck you. Jackendoff, which is Chomsky's graduate student, is completely shocked. And Randy Allen Harris makes the point that back in 1969, saying fuck then was different than saying fuck now. Now it's just part of the parlance. But back in 1969, it was the height of incivility. So Chomsky's graduate student, Jackendoff, is just taken aback. There's a description there where it says he looked like he'd been slapped. And then just responds back into the microphone, well, fuck you, George. And then they get into the screaming obscenities over the microphones. Or, sorry, not screaming, maybe yelling. So, it's little things like that where some of these things get more color. Now, in the second edition, and are subsequently more interesting. Now, I'm sure this probably says more about me than it does about the book, but I found those episodes, the narrative parts, the personal animosities, the breakdown of civil decorum, the gossipy parts of the book, to be much more interesting than the grammar parts of the book, and much easier to understand as well. That was a factor. Now, I guess that's me going right to the lowest common denominator stuff, huh? I could just be a Philistine, or you might find you have a similar reading experience. I'm embarrassed to admit it, obviously, but those types of things were the things about the book that really stuck in my mind. Also, as I mentioned with my review of the first edition, the cultural and political implications. This was going on during the Vietnam War, during the 1960s counterculture, and so that was influenced everything. Chomsky, as I said at the beginning of this review, was very political, and the other guys were quite political as well. So that was all stuff that was very interesting. That's all stuff I got into in the first edition. I did find, and I don't know what your mileage would be on this, but like when I was getting into the gossipy parts or the drama parts, my brain would process that in a different level. So like I would shift gears downwards, so to speak. So like, okay, I'm reading the juicy drama, the juicy gossip. I can read quickly through here. This is not difficult to understand. And then when we got back into the technical linguistics part, my brain had a difficulty upgrading again. So as much as I enjoyed those juicy bits, I did find switching gears in my brain a little bit difficult with reading it. I don't know. Anyone else who has read this book, let me know what your experience of reading that was. But then we get into the end of the book, and here is where the second edition, Chapter 7 is generative semantics, the collapse. But then the last few chapters, and you can see here, some of this is footnotes, but still you can see this is a hefty part of the book, is getting into new territory. So again, if you've already read the first edition, you can see where you're getting your money's worth here in the second edition. With linguistics at closing time. Now this was interesting, but it was difficult for me because it was kind of a very quick overview of a whole bunch of linguistic theories that had sprouted out at the end of the 20th century. Only about maybe like half of which I vaguely understood. Although, again, to be fair to the author, he keeps things moving at a good clip, for better or for worse. For worse in the sense that it's difficult to understand that he's going through it so quickly, but for better in the sense that if you're not understanding it, you get to the next section fairly quickly. Talks about how Chomsky has redesigned his program, and some of this gave me new appreciation for the Chomsky's Universal Grammar, which I struggled through a couple of years ago. Talks about George Lakoff, who I've hardly talked at all about in this review, but he's also an equally fascinating person. And he had a renaissance at the end of the 20th century or the early 21st century. He had a book, Metaphors We Live By, which Randy Allen Harris gives a interesting review of that, talking about both the presumptions of the book. Lakoff presented himself as the first person to discover metaphor, but also the importance of the book in terms of the new ground it broke. And Lakoff also became prominent as a political linguist, kind of giving Democrats framing strategies in the early 2000s, and was a bit of a celebrity, although apparently, I mean, I lived through those years and I don't remember hearing Lakoff during that time. Of course, I was living abroad at that time, so I don't know. That may have had something to do with that. Although I have heard Metaphors We Live By and George Lakoff quoted in some of the English language teaching methodology books, particularly Michael Lewis' The Lexical Approach, which is another book I've reviewed on this channel. So yeah, that was interesting hearing Lakoff's legacy and also Chomsky's legacy. Now, there's a number of interesting things here. I'm not going to have time to talk about them all, but it talked about Steven Pinker's association with Chomsky. So Steven Pinker's The Language Instinct, I think, must have come out after the first edition of this, right? First edition was 1993. The Language Instinct was, 94 or 95? So about the same time or shortly after. And I read The Language Instinct and have reviewed it on this channel. That was one of my first insights into Chomsky and linguistics. And, you get the impression from The Language Instinct that Chomsky and linguistics is all about the human genetic capability for grammar, which confused me when I actually got into Chomsky's Universal Grammar, because Chomsky's Universal Grammar here is all about these confusing sentence trees, and very little about how language is connected to genetics. But what Randy Allen Harris described was that it was actually Pinker who brought genetics to the forefront, genetics is the wrong word. The concept of universal grammar being embedded in evolution to the forefront of Chomsky's theories, something Chomsky had not previously embraced. I'm framing that wrong. The nuance gets a little tricky here. What words do I want to say? Pinker in his book makes very clear the difference between his view of evolution and Chomsky's view of evolution. But biological, that's the word I'm looking for. Pinker is the one who associates Chomsky with with grammar being something biological, and in that sense part of our genetic endowment. And then another interesting thing here is Pinker got into a scuffle with, a back and forth with Lakoff in the late 2000s. So that was another interesting thing. And then we get to chapter 10, which is Chomsky Agonistes. And this is a really interesting chapter. And I've been talking for quite a while now, so I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to do this justice here. And to a certain extent, maybe I don't need to, maybe you can buy the book and read the book yourself. Actually, maybe that's the best strategy. There's a lot of interesting things in here about Chomsky's legacy, Chomsky's place in the culture, how Chomsky, who is, how Chomsky is at 93 and still not slowing down, still being very active, speaking politically, giving his thoughts on all kinds of things. And it also talks about, it talks about, as maybe you can see with the title, Chomsky's propensity to be argumentative for the sake of argumentative, which seems to have influenced the history of linguistics and is arguably the whole reason for the linguistic wars. Chomsky seemed to be replying because of vanity and not, it's a little bit, you're always doing some guesswork of other people's motivations, but it seemed to be that his motivations were grounded in just shooting down an opposing theory than the advancement of the science. But it also talks about the various misrepresentations and falsehoods that Chomsky engages in or has engaged in. And this is where I said, like at the beginning of the review, that if you're still enamored with Chomsky as an idol, this section would take him off his pedestal a peg or two. And yet it's still a largely sympathetic, or an attempt to be sympathetic, view towards Chomsky's motives or his place in the culture, his advocacy work, and ends with some interesting predictions about his legacy. And it's a really interesting last chapter, and I think I'll just leave it like that rather than trying to summarize everything. I think I said this with my review of the first edition, but it's impossible to talk about everything. All I'll say is that there's a lot of complicated stuff in here, but a lot of interesting stuff in here. So cautious recommendation, but it is a recommendation.